All right, friends, David here. So glad to have you here today on our webinar. It is time to get started. So today we're talking about the lightShark for church lighting. It's going to be fun. First things first, as we get into this, there's not a massive amount of people on today's webinar, but regardless, I'd like to go over some basic instructions. It's just like getting on a plane. You got to know where the safety card is and how to jump out in case of a water landing. Well, in today's case, there is the most important thing is down at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a chat and a Q&A section. The chat is wonderful and helpful if I ask a survey question or you just want to chat with other people. But if you do have a question over what we are going over, please do place it in the Q&A section. This makes it so A, I don't miss it, and B, if it's not the right time to answer it and I want to answer it later, I can leave it in there and not lose track of it. So I make sure that I go ahead and answer your questions. Um, while we get started here, let me know super quick, can you see my screen and hear my voice? Just give me the double check that everything is working. This also helps me see how much of a delay we have today. It's usually about 8 seconds or so. And I also want to ask you to remove distractions today. Today's webinar will be from an hour to about 90 minutes, depending on questions and whatnot. And so be aware of that. And if you, can close that door, turn off that phone just as I have and focus fully on today's webinar. Awesome. Now with that, guys, we're going to talk about the lightShark for church lighting. So I want to know from you guys as we talk about hardware options first. What lightShark do you most often use? Are you an LS1 person, an LS wing, maybe, or a core rather, or a wing person, or are you looking to learn more today? Maybe you haven't used any of them at all. Let me know in the chat. And while those come in, we'll talk about those options. You heard me say maybe you were just wanting to learn more. Uh, so we've got the LS1 and the LS Core. These are the main two pieces of the lightShark system. So as you may be aware or may not, they are the same console. The difference being that the LS Core is just a box. It just runs the software. You dial into it via a web browser and then are able to use it. And the LS1 is a full-fledged console surface. So they have the same processing capabilities, the same power, but the LS1 has these 10 playback faders plus a master. It's got the buttons above and below the playback, the function keys, the wheels, the screen, a lot of really great stuff so that you can make a show work really well. Actually, I was talking with a student the other night of mine, and he had just gotten a lightShark, and he was mentioning, he said, David, you really got to sell to people and remember that when you compare, programming on a core versus a one, and there are times when both are the better option, but when you think about sitting down and programming, he's like, man, the LS1, those encoder wheels and just the ability to see things on the small screen and have access to these buttons on the side, they really just make, especially working with moving lights, but even LEDs that just have color, they just make it that much easier. And I couldn't agree more. The LS1, as well as the Wing, which we'll talk about in a second, feature a nice tablet stand. And so just some examples as we get into things here is, I get a lot of questions from folks about actually, before we get there, about different setups. Should I go with the LS Core? Should I go with the LS1? What's the best fit? And there's no right answer for everybody, right? But in general, if you're going to do a lot of programming, you probably want to spring for the LS1. If you think you'll program out some basic scenes and then, install this thing and leave it there and, you don't need physical faders, then you probably want to look at an LS Core. That's probably going to be the better option for your needs. In addition, the LS Core is rack mountable. They both are technically, but of course, the LS Core takes very little space in a rack and can be great for those permanent installs that are looking to keep the footprint small. And so, as I mentioned, there are a few other pieces of the lightShark range, including the LS nodes. And so, one of the questions we get a lot is, okay, if we've got the LS1 and we've got the LS Core, and maybe we're designing a system to install in a church, or we're installing a system in our church, etc., what do we need an LS node for as compared to a console, right? So the consoles, as you may be aware, have two DMX ports on board, and they are tied to the first two universes of DMX. Now, both consoles, that's why I have them both listed here, have 8 universes of DMX on board. And so what that looks like is, okay, you can get over the network all 8 universes. And so that's where a node comes in. A node comes in when either you want to get more universes than you had on board of the console, or rather than running DMX cable to different places, you want to go ahead and place nodes. And that's how a lot of integrators that I talk to are doing newer systems, and how I design systems for folks as well when I do so. Um, because as we look at future proofing setups, especially in installations, when it comes to a given truss above a stage, or in a church especially, you've got a couple trusses or some side light positions, maybe you've got lights on the ground, etc. The old method of doing it, and the way you might be familiar with it, is going out of your console, having a 1 or 2 universes of DMX come out, running DMX lines from the sound booth, the front of house area, all the way to the stage. And then if you needed to go to multiple places, like a couple different trusses or a truss and the ground, you would use a DMX splitter. Okay. And you would split that signal. And then as long as you were watching your amount of channels, and you stayed within one DMX universe, which is 512 channels, then you would be good. You'd be good to go. The problem comes in with many newer fixtures. They can start to have really high channel counts, especially if you want to get really complex control of them. And when this happens, you fill up DMX universes much more easily. And so, what we like to do, and what a lot of integrators do, as I was mentioning, is just taking each truss and running network to all the trusses, running network back to the sound booth, and then putting it all on the network and putting a node on each truss. That way, it's got fresh DMX signal right there. And if you ever needed to split up, maybe you start out and you have a node on your front truss, a node on your back truss, right? And they're both on the same universe. But maybe later on, you start to get lights that have more channels, because as we go into the future, as I've been watching this for 15 years or so now, as we go into the future, lights are just going to have more channels than they had before, right? And they're going to use up DMX universes more quickly. And so then you can go ahead and split that into 2 different universes, as well as just not need a splitter. Say you have a bunch of lights on one truss, maybe it's a bunch of LED pars. They don't take more than a universe, but you need a DMX splitter in there to keep the signal strong, okay? Because the DMX standard says we can only have 32 DMX devices in a chain. So you need a splitter on that truss. Well, just get a node with at least 2 ports on it. You can assign those 2 ports both to the same universe, and then it's acting the same as a splitter. And many times the cost difference is none at all. And then you're still future proofing yourself. So that's how we like to set them up. And it's going to save you, of course, that DMX cable, because you can just put it on the network from your sound booth to your stage, and also make things future proof. Now, we also have, so we could have 1 node, we could have multiple nodes off the same console, and we could even, well, this is a good point, we could even, just so you're aware, set up in the nodes a primary backup type situation if you wanted to do that. So you can actually have 2 lightShark consoles, or a lightShark console and some other type of controller, maybe something you have existing in your church or something like that. And you can have 2 controllers and actually set up a merge between them, so that whichever one has the highest level gets the output from the node. And you can do that inside the node itself. These things are actually really powerful, but pretty simple to configure as well. And so that's something to highlight. Now, what about the wing? Okay. So I mentioned the wing earlier. It looks like this. It's this guy over here. And so the wing's got some different modes and can do a lot of different things, but that doesn't mean it has to be confusing. And I want to highlight for a minute here how it can be useful to a church. The first is that we can put it in USB mode. Okay. And that's what this is highlighting best, is that you place the wing right next to the console, either a core or a 1. You plug it in via USB. When you boot up the console and the wing together, they identify each other. And then the wing for a LS1, when you plug it in, is faders 11 through 20. For an LS core, it's faders 1 through 10. That just happens automatically when you boot it up. Okay. Um, and you can do that all day long. And then it's automatically set up. It's going to be the faders 11 through 20. And also, oh, the first two rows of the executor buttons at the top here. Okay. Now, the Wing has, if you're familiar with the LS1, it's got the tablet shelf. The Wing's got the same shelf in there as well for holding a second tablet. And this is a great solution for the Wing. But we can do more with it. Okay. So the Wing on the back has 3 network ports. It's actually a gigabit network switch that enables you to hook it up to the lightShark console. And there are now 2 DMX outputs on the Wing itself as well. So you can actually, through the network, even if it's just a network cable between the LS1 and the Wing, or the core and the Wing, just, right next to each other, you can get 2 more DMX outputs right there. Those DMX ports could be the same universes 1 and 2 that are on the back of the console, or they could be any combination of different universes available. Okay. Um, and so that's a huge feature of the Wing as well, that can be really helpful, because you might have been like, okay, I I needed already a node maybe to get DMX output. Maybe you put this in and you've got 2 ports on it. But it can even do more. So the Wing allows you to put space, if you use the networked mode on the Wing, between the console and the Wing. So now maybe you have the LS core, and the core is, 100 feet away in a closet somewhere in a rack, but the Wing is at your control position, right? Or your LS1 is in the sound booth, but your Wing is on the stage. So that if you have somebody that needs to be able to walk in from backstage and get some basic control, or get control from the stage, they could do that. You could give them their own faders. Even one thing I've seen people use the Wings for is they'll position the Wing at the video control room, which might be in a different place, and give the video control people some control over the intensity levels of the lights, so they can ride that. The lighting volunteer can run lights from the console, and everybody's happy and great. And so, as I mentioned, you can network these so they can be a network apart anywhere on the same network. And you can also get, when you're on the network again, those 2 DMX outputs through the nodes that are built into the back of the Wing. Okay. Um, and even more, just when we're talking about church and house of worship production, um, there is the MIDI mode and OSC mode available on the Wing, just different modes to put the Wing in to configure it. And so it doesn't even have to be used with the lightShark console. Okay. It literally can be used with any device that uses OSC or MIDI. Okay. So what you're looking at here is, okay, maybe you have a lightShark for your lights, but you don't need a Wing for your lighting. Your lighting's fairly basic, and the lightShark does everything you need. That's great. But maybe you need an extra set of faders via OSC for an audio console. Maybe you want to hook it up as a MIDI controller to Ableton, and now you have output levels for all of your channels of different backing tracks. Maybe you use it for a mixture of programs. There's a lot of possibilities in there, so I definitely want to highlight that as well. And thinking of programs like Ableton, now that we've kind of talked about the hardware, um, I want to take a quick pause, since we've talked for about 10, 15 minutes now about hardware, and see if you have any questions about hardware and just like use case, type setups. Like, okay, how would I do this kind of thing with hardware? Let me know. And then I'm going to begin chatting about triggering. So one of the things I like to do, so feel free to put those questions about hardware in the question section, the Q&A. But one of the things that makes the lightShark really powerful and really useful, especially for the church and house of worship market, is the fact that we can trigger it via MIDI, via OSC, and via UDP. Now, if that sounds like, a bunch of gobbledygook and some foreign language, don't worry, it doesn't have to be. We've got videos on the WorkPro TV YouTube channel showing you how to set up a lot of these. My recommendation for most people is, if you're using a backing track program or a lyrics program like ProPresenter or Proclaim, um, look into and watch the video, and you can convert the MIDI signal that these programs send out to OSC, and then send it over the network to the lightShark. Alternatively, you can actually use physical USB to MIDI adapters, and that does work, but the cost is generally about the same either way, and it's less than $100. And so, the cool thing about this, which we're going to talk about when we dive into the console in just a couple minutes, is that when we begin to automate our church installations and our services, what we're able to do is get kind of the best of both worlds, because we get consistency from automating, meaning the volunteer doesn't miss bringing up the scene, they don't forget to hit a button, or you don't give them more cues than they can handle. So you get that consistency where every time, say, a certain background in your lyrics program is selected, it's going to make the colors of the lighting match. You can trigger that with the lightShark, and that frees up your volunteer to be able to enjoy the service and follow along, and add some other things in, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So if this is a new thing to you, if you're like, oh, I never even realized we could do that, then I encourage you definitely to check out the YouTube videos at Work Pro TV, because there are guides on how to use most of these programs with the lightShark, and they'll really help you get started. Because ultimately, if you can set up some automation, like I said before, it makes it makes it so that there is great lighting, even when you're not there, or if you're not running things, if you've got to do something else, whether you're the worship pastor, the tech director, you got to run sound, whatever. Okay, so I'm really big on automation, and I really appreciate the tools that are in the lightShark to make that happen. Cool. Now, what I'd like to know as we gander into this next section on the software is, what do you do at a church or at your church? Are you a church volunteer? Are you a church staff member? Like, and tell me, are you a tech director? Are you a pastor, worship pastor, creative pastor, whatever? Are you an integrator? Do you install churches? Let me know in the chat. I would love to see, just so that as we go through the rest of this presentation, I know who I'm talking to, and what you do in relations to churches. Cool. Well, while we wait for those to come in, a couple answers. Cool. We got an integrator. Awesome. Um, through this next portion, I'm going to demonstrate some ways that we can set up the lightShark for church lighting. Okay. So this one, unlike some of our other webinars, like our beginning and advanced ones, isn't as much of a like follow along type setup. It's more of a me demonstrating, okay, here's how I come in, to a church and program this from scratch, and here's how you can do it, kind of thing. So don't feel like you have to follow along perfectly with this webinar. I may go quickly at times, but this is more about giving you the frameworks and the templates, really, to be able to program along. Awesome. So we got some integrators here, and I'm sure on the replay as well, we will get some folks who work in churches and whatever else. Cool. Awesome. So when we talk about software setup for church lighting and setting up the lightShark to work well with a church, there's a number of different things that we think about. Okay. Obviously, as you guys know, integrators or church people or whatnot, when we talk about churches and other houses of worship and that whole market, there is a wide variety of different situations and different looking churches, especially when it comes to lighting, right? You know, there are going to be churches that are very chill, very laid back, very traditional. There may be one or two cues per service or three or four, but it's going to be very simple. That's going to be it. And then, of course, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, and it is a spectrum, so there's people in between at every point. There is the very modern, high energy, rock type or rock pop type worship that has a lot of cues, is very dynamic, has great visuals, is constantly moving and engaging people's attention. And then, of course, there are most churches in the world which are somewhere between the two, right? And so as we talk about that today, I want to cover different situations. And so we're going to start at the simplest, and then we're going to get more complicated as we set up. So the simplest way to set up the lightShark for a church is to use just the executors page. And probably many of you, awesome. Rodney just wrote that he's an AVL, a volunteer group leader. I am as well, by the way, at my church. Um, and so the executors page is really the best way to set up a very simple setup for a church. So I'm going to a blank executor page here. And if you're an integrator, this is one of those things where, gosh, if you just take this, put it on a tablet and lock this, there are even wall mounted tablets available that some folks use. Um, this could be perfect for that simpler church where you're just going to go ahead, select some lights and, make some different scenes. So you'll make, one scene maybe. We'll record it to this first button and it's going to be, full lights, walk in, and then we have another scene. Maybe I'll go horizontally here and we're going to call that, uh, music. Then maybe we have another one and we call that preaching. And then we have another one and we call that one special music. Okay. And as you guys know, with some churches that you probably work with, these 4 buttons will be plenty for some of their needs, right? They'll do everything they need and more. Okay. And maybe you'll have a couple more for special events and things like funerals and weddings that happen, that require a little bit of a different look, right? And that's all you need. So with the executors, if you're not familiar, when you go vertically, they override each other, but horizontally, they actually do not. However, there's a couple settings in the menu that can really help us out here. So if we head up here into the 3 dots in the upper left and then into the menu, we have, first of all, an executors mode. Okay. If we switch that to exclusive, only one executor will work at a time. And that's really helpful, especially for integrator type people who are setting this up or people who just aren't super familiar with lighting, right? Because I know a lot of integrators out there have a background in audio and lighting's, not always your first thing, right? And then we also have the ability to lock the executors. And so I'm not going to do that right now, but you can turn this on. You set a password and then they can't get out of that screen unless they have the password. So that can be great if you know that you can give the pastor the password, have them lock it, and you write it down so that if they forget, you can tell them what it is. And then, maybe there's an overzealous volunteer. Like there was a church locally here a couple years ago I was working with, and they called me like, a year and a half after I'd last been there and they said, hey, we hired this guy. He was going to be a children's pastor and do some other things. And he worked with the lighting and he really messed some things up, and thankfully I had saved the old file. Then I was able to just send him the file, help him get it in there. And it was fine. Right. But this prevents that, right? This prevents, volunteers who might be a little overzealous from changing and updating things on a given week. Okay. Um, and so you can lock that and that's super helpful. But the exclusive mode, as I mentioned, when we pop it in that mode, we now have the ability to switch between any of these scenes and only one plays at a time. Okay. Now, another question that I do get a lot is, okay, but there's no fade time on these scenes. And of course, if it's a more traditional church, you've got to have a fade time, probably a pretty slow fade time between them. And even if it's not a super traditional church, you want the lights to fade and not snap between different cues, right? So the way to do that is if you go to the cue list window and you scroll down, and this is an example show, so there's a bunch of stuff on it. You scroll down and you find your cues, like these are here. You can go in and set a crossfade. So maybe I set that to 3 and then a fade in and fade out. And usually I just set these all the same unless you're doing something that really requires the fade out to be different than the fade in. And it just doesn't happen that much, right? If you're doing theater, yeah, maybe. If not, probably not. Okay. So you go in there, you set the timing on those 3, and then the executors will fade. Okay. So do keep that in mind. That is helpful as well. So the exclusive mode makes it so that across this whole page, only one executor can be played back at a time. And this can be really helpful, not just for those super traditional churches, but maybe I know Jamie Brock down in Florida has installed some of um, these wall mounted Android tablets. And, they allow you to have an industrial wall mounted tablet that could be a wall station basically for the lighting with a locked executor page. And then, anybody can walk up, right? A volunteer, a church member, whoever's unlocking the building, right, and opening the room, they can walk in and just press full house lights, and they can get full lights, and even give them a few basic scenes so that if there's a basic kids program whatever, a chapel session, maybe you got a school on site, and you don't need to have a tech person there to touch the lights, then they can just turn them on and off themselves, and so that is super helpful as well. Now, when you are looking just to take executors kind of up a notch, um, is when you want to use the normal mode of executors. Let's talk about that. So the normal mode back here in the menu is for when you don't want the executors going side to side to automatically override each other. So what are good instances when you want this? Well, um, you definitely want them to override each other side to side, up and down, everywhere. When you only want one of these scenes to play back at a time, right? These scenes are going to, contain a full look that, does everything you need, and that's it, right? Um, and these are a great option for that. But sometimes you don't want that. So maybe it still could be an LS core, it could be an LS1, but maybe you've got to set up more like this, where I've got different sets of lights here, washes, backlight, spots, washes, and more spots. Okay. And I've got different attributes as I go down. So my first couple rows are colors here. And then we've got some positions for two different types of lights. And then we've got some gobos, right? Pretty simple. Something simple like this can be great in that church where, okay, you're installing a system. They want to do a little more with their lighting, but they don't have any volunteers that are really up to speed on that, right? They're like, yeah, we want to be able to do cool stuff, change the colors, whatnot, but we don't know how to program it. We don't want to mess with it from week to week. We don't necessarily have anyone knowledgeable to be our volunteers. And so the great thing about this is you could just set this in front of somebody, tell them, okay, this row are these lights, and show them, right? Click through it and, you look at it and say, oh, yeah, those are those lights, right? And then these lights are these lights, right? And you can very quickly give them just basic control of something like color. And now they can follow along with the service, make appropriate calls, or you can make it for them and write down what to do, and they're able to change the colors and influence the mood and amplify the message on stage without really having to have any experience. They don't have to get in to the palettes page here and be programming. In fact, probably don't want them to be, right? They can just stay here on the executors, be locked into that, and get the ability to maybe set some different intensity levels, set some colors, set some positions. Done. Okay. Um, as I mentioned before, though, so that can work for simple situations, but obviously you can probably see if if you have a church that's wanting to take it up to the next notch, a church that's going, okay, we've seen this, but we want to do more with our lighting without having to engage our volunteers deeper, without having to train them more. It's hard enough to find qualified volunteers to run sound, and that's probably your first priority. And I get that. Much less finding good people to run lights. It's just not going to happen. Well, that's where we start to talk about the automated methods of lighting. So as I mentioned, the lightShark is really open on automation so that you can set it up to be automated from OSC, from MIDI, as well as a few other protocols. And so when you're doing that, all you've got to do is set up, like, here's a cue list here from a theatrical demo. And this cue list here has, 4 different cues in it, and it could have 10. And so think about this for a minute as a cue list for a song. That's one of the methods that I like to teach people for setting up. Maybe, like a lot of churches, there's only so many worship songs you do. Sure, from time to time you introduce something new, and that would take a little bit of programming to get that in. But for the most part, on a given week, probably all or most of your songs are going to be the same songs that you previously did, right? And so in that case, you could have that pre-programmed and use it from week to week to week. Okay. So if you took a song and you programmed out for that song 4 or 5 cues, you've got introduction, you've got a cue for verses that you bring up a few times, you've got chorus, of course, and you've got a bridge, right? That's like 5 cues. Okay. You build those into a cue list. And then what you want to do is real simple. Um, you just end up going ahead and trigger that from a third party program. Okay, so you trigger that maybe from ProPresenter. You can trigger that from Proclaim. Those are two of the most popular, worship lyric programs. You're probably using one of them in your churches. And so, and you can do that out of the box with ProPresenter 7. It's built in for free. It's included. It wasn't previously. With Proclaim, it's built in. It's included in the cost of that. So you can trigger via MIDI, send that, like I mentioned, through either USB to MIDI interfaces or using an OSC program, translator program that are very inexpensive. And you can send them over to the lightShark. And then the cool thing about that is there's really two ways to look at that. Okay, so the first is that you trigger, the cues for the song from the lyrics. When they hit the first lyric of the chorus on the slides, it triggers the chorus cue here, right? Um, but then if you want to, you can still engage a volunteer to do lighting. And maybe then you record on your bottom faders some effects and some different things they control. Okay. So you could give them, the simplest way to do it for a more modern worship is give them a cue right here. You will give them a cue right here. And this is going to be a movement, okay, of pan and tilt. Oops. You could program another cue next to that and give them the ability to control a color effect. Right? We could give them the ability, maybe we give them, just a nice little intensity pulse. And so then our volunteer, sure, for the most part, they're just watching the computer automate the songs. They're making sure they play the cues at the right time. But then as well, as they see opportunities to add in a little bit of movement or a little bit of a color effect or a little bit of an intensity thing, they can add in just a little bit of flavor to that lighting. Just make it a little more interesting as they feel the room shift, as they, feel the energy of the room, they can respond to that with lighting. And so that's one of the things I really like to, if you're using what I call the songs method here, you're pre-programming some songs, but it doesn't just have to be automated by robots in the sense that you can have someone still running the lights and they can react as things happen. But the cool thing about this approach is that if you can't get a volunteer, okay, it's gonna run fine on itself, right? As long as you tested it, your automation set up sound in a way that works well, you're totally able to, just turn on the console, let it run, and it's gonna run, right? It's gonna do what it's gonna do. And most people may not notice the difference, right? Most people, we'll be like, oh yeah, same as always. Some people will notice, right? And then if they say something, that's a good opportunity to say, hey, would you like to volunteer? Um, and that can be a great way to do that. The more low maintenance version of this that I like to do is maybe you hear me say, okay, I don't want to program a cue list here for every song that's got like 5 cues in it, right? Week to week, I don't want to put any time into it. I want to pre-program the lighting at one point, have it all programmed in. Maybe as an integrator, you program in a bunch of stuff, and then they don't want to program anything in the future, but they still want some flexibility. Well, that's when I go ahead on my executors, and you can use them in either mode. I usually use the exclusive for this. And instead of having different lights and different options that people can choose from, I do more of a method like this. But instead of across these buttons doing full scenes, I only work with color. Okay. Because in lighting, color is really the most powerful tool that we have here. It really is, where if you're looking to change the way that the room feels, color is the biggest way we can do it. And so if you fill up this page, which is what, it's 6 by 8, I believe. It's 8 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 by 8. That's 48 different color combinations that you could give that church, right? And then the cool thing about that, just for super hands-off approach, is say you've got some different color combos in here. Let's just sketch some out here. Um, so we'll do like a red, blue, cyan, green. We'll do a red, cyan. In our second row, I like to do colors that are a little closer together. Do a blue, violet, do red, orange, do a green and blue, and maybe here do green, magenta. So you go ahead, you build a bunch of color combinations. Maybe you fill up all the buttons, maybe you don't. And then the cool thing about this is if you're using backgrounds, worship motion backgrounds or just static images of different colors, you can just trigger automatically from your program. You send a different MIDI note for each of these, and then you're able to map these so that anytime, as I mentioned, anytime that that particular background fires, okay, that green blue background fires, it makes the lights green blue. So then you're putting that control now in a volunteer who's doing the slides, who's really paying attention to the songs. And then maybe you go ahead and you build out some faders with some effects like this, but you also build out some faders maybe for each part of the service, where you've got the intensity levels of the lights for the walk-in, and for the announcements, and for the music, right? And you build a couple cues there that they can bring up and they can fire. Then they have a couple effects, but then the colors and whatnot are just going to be matched and always running from your presentation software. This is why I'm so big on this stuff, because ultimately, when you do this and you have it built into your presentation software, then it just happens automatically. If there's no volunteer, if you can't get somebody, it still happens, right? It takes a little bit of more work on the front end, but I think it's worth it, because at the end of the day, you get so much more, just a much more, both consistent, and you have the ability to get more complex in your programming and in your church's lighting. And so that's kind of my biggest thing is with volunteers when we're talking about. I know with everybody in churches, you're working with volunteers, right? That's what everybody works with in churches. Many times, even, I mean, bigger churches have some staff, but for every staff member, there's many volunteers, right? And getting it to be consistent can be a hybrid of both something that's automated, that's triggered from an outside source, whether that be a worship leader, a slides person, whomever, and then also um, a hybrid of that and having them run things live. And so you get that live feel without, having to be stuck. And so, yeah, guys. So do we have any questions thus far on church lighting in general, or some of this software setup stuff that I've talked about, ways that you can set things up? Let me know in the questions or in the chat if you have any questions thus far. And then if we do have time here at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about lighting for video and some things to look out for, since that's been something very important as of late, and talk about how to make that work a little bit better. But let me know, guys, any questions thus far. Let us know in the chat. Glad to answer really anything about church lighting as a whole. All right, I'm not seeing any come in. That's all right. If you do have a question, though, feel free to bring it in, and we'll definitely have time to answer those for you. But I want to talk about lighting for video. So obviously, before 2020, live streams and video was a thing in the church, but it definitely wasn't as important as it's become today, right? And even I think as we return to normalcy, even as in the future at some point we see full in-person church being a normal thing again, live stream's still going to be an important thing. I don't think this is going to go away. And so I want to talk briefly and kind of show you in the lightShark some ways that I like to set things up when you're live streaming, okay, so that you can make it look absolutely the best it can be. Okay. So the biggest thing, as many of you guys probably know, whether you're integrators or something else, is that when you're working with cameras, you want to keep them at a manual exposure. And then you need to keep your lighting level within a tighter range than the human eye is going to care about, right? And so when I'm programming away, there's a couple things that I like to do that can really help. Okay, so let's start, for example, with these are moving head wash type light. For anything that has a dimmer control, which in the lightShark, it's either going to have a dimmer or a virtual dimmer. The first thing I like to do when I'm lighting for video is for any cues that are kind of like my overall cues for the service, I want to first balance out that intensity level. And I do that with the palettes in the lightShark. So say, for example, I take this wash light and I bring it to full. And that looks good. Actually, I'm not going to record yet. And that looks good on the camera. Okay. Now I take this LED strip light and I start to bring it up, and I'm just simulating this here. And around 60%, it looks just as bright as the first light. Then I'm going to stop right there. Okay. And then I take my next light. These guys, they end up at about 80%, and they look just as bright. They look balanced and nothing's blown out or underexposed on the camera. And then I take my last light, and these guys are bright and they make it up to 30%, and then they're good. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is build that with open shutters as well for any lights that have shutters. I want to build that intensity into a palette. And I'm going to call that my full palette right here. Okay. And that's my first step to really full step. I say step by right, step right, full. I'll just call it full. So that's really my first step is I'll build in that full palette. And then depending on how I'm going to run my service back, I may record that intensity level into various cues, etc. But that's always where I want to start. I want to make it so that when I select any combination of lights, that when I hit full, it's going to come to that full level that I've defined. Okay. So that we're able to go ahead, come to full, and it's not going to bring like those lights that are super bright that I don't want to bring above 30%. It's not really going to be something where people bring it up past that percentage, and therefore we don't get that blowout on camera. The other place that I see a lot things blowing out on camera, and you're going to see this, right, is when we've got LED lights. Okay. Maybe I bring these to full, and then we go to color. And we've got LED lights pointed at our stage, and you may notice that either A, they're always really blown out. Maybe they're just behind the stage. Excuse me. Maybe they're always blown out. Or maybe they only blow out in certain colors on the camera, and certain colors look really bad and other colors look good, right? When we're working with live streams, we want to really balance out those colors for the room. And so while the lightShark has color palettes for many lights, where you're able to, press these colored buttons and the light changes to that color, I actually advocate making your own. Okay. Because what you can do is match the intensity level, especially in LEDs, between different colors. Okay. Because an LED, as we may know, creates its color from red, green, and blue, and maybe a few other channels of colors, right? With the, amber and a white and a UV. Okay. That's how it makes colors, right? And so that means if we go to a cyan, that's now green and blue at full. But if we go to a blue, that's only blue at full. And the difference between the two, though it may seem painfully obvious, is that you're shooting out around twice as much light. Some LEDs are more efficient than other LEDs, et cetera. But the analogy's there. A color like a cyan, a secondary color like a cyan or a magenta, or anything that's a mix of multiple colors is going to be brighter than any single pure color out of those LEDs. Okay. And so when you're building your color palettes, you really want to do it with a camera up so that you can see those colors being built when you're working with a camera. And that way, when you run into, say, a cyan and you say, whoa, okay, that way blows out, you just on the color channels bring that back so that wherever it lands and looks right, and is exposed correctly in the camera, not blowing out, you now record that to your palette. Okay. Maybe we just call it cyan camera safe. Okay. And that way, whether this light in that particular cue for the impact, whether it's at full, whether it's at half that, whether it's just on a little bit, between different colors, you're going to see the same intensity level. And those colors aren't going to then blow out or, they're not going to become more blown out or, less. Okay. It's always going to feel consistent, and a change in color isn't going to change the impact of that intensity. So between those two tips, that's my biggest one for you guys is like, okay, when you're programming worship lighting, and you're like, okay, you know, I'm ready to go. I want to make this look great on camera for these people. It's all about just looking through the camera. You don't have to get fancy with a meter and stuff. I do, but that's me as a lighting designer. If you're an integrator, church volunteer, whatever, don't worry about that. The biggest key, and you can do everything you need to just by looking through that camera, by getting a camera up on a monitor in front of you, or looking through that camera and then going, okay, I'm going to balance out the overall intensity of these lights so that they look good. And then also in the color, and this is the one that a lot of people miss. In the color, you also want to record your colors to be camera safe so that when you've got a color that's a mix of multiple LEDs, especially in LEDs, you're going to be able to scale that back so that it's not overly bright, so that it's not like something that, like the sun's coming up when it turns to white, right? From a blue. Sometimes you want that impact, but when you do, use the intensity to help make that, right? So anyway, guys, that's what I've got in my notes for today's webinar. But let me know what questions you have about the things that we've discussed today about church and house of worship lighting and how we can make it and do an excellent job of it with the lightShark, because ultimately that's what we're here to do is equip you to either for your church or churches you're installing, make the best lighting that we can make for you guys. So feel free to put questions in the chat or the question and answer section. Either is fine right now since I'm paying attention to it and not teaching and through the moment. And we're glad to answer those. Any questions you've run into, maybe as you're programming the lightShark, could just be general lightShark stuff, whatever. I'm here for you guys to get these answered. Awesome, guys. Feel free. I was going to say any questions. I know I just got to thank you, but I'll leave questions in here so that we make sure we answer questions that you guys have to make sure things are answered. And we're glad to do so. And by we, I mean me. Travis, you're struggling with interfacing a visualizer. Can I ask what visualizer you're using? And then we can talk about it. So feel free to type that in. I'm going to start talking about visualizers just from the start. So when you're working with a visualizer, oh, and let me know too, Travis, as well. Are you within the same computer or are you on a different computer? Just so I'm aware. So what we're going to do with the visualizer is we want to go here to our menu, our main menu, and to our network setup page, okay? And our visualizer is going to rely on the DMX streaming down here in order to get its information, okay? So the way it's going to work is it's really just like working with lights, okay? Um, and so you're using L8CE or Magic Fizz on a different computer. So the first thing I would do with either of those is um, wire in the network. You have to wire in the network to the lightShark, first of all. Make sure the IP address of the computer is within the same range as the DMX streaming interface here. So that means the first three numbers, like this one is 192.168.0, but yours might be, if it's the default, 2.0.0. And then the third numbers, or the fourth number rather, is different. If that's the case, you want those first three numbers to be the same, fourth number to be different. And then the subnet mask is great at 255.0.0.0. So you want to make sure that's set up first. That's my first checklist mark there when working with the visualizer. Then, of course, in the computer, you need to patch the lights. Okay, but definitely, when usually the ticket for people is making sure the IP address is in the same range. Then in your visualizer, you're able to pick up on the DMX data coming in. You need to make sure, of course, as well on the DMX setup page that we're using ArtNet or SACN, that it's enabled. I like SACN better. It tends to pick up better in most visualizers, but they're all different. And make sure you apply that and have the DMX streaming set up, and then you should be good to go. If you're having other issues than that, then the answer is going to be something in your setup. But usually for most people that gets them going right is making sure, again, that IP address is set and in the same range, that you're following the instructions from the particular visualizer, of course, on how to set up their visualizer, and then that you do make sure you have ArtNet or SACN turned on here and enabled. And of course, that you're wired through the data port, very important, through the Ethernet port on your lightShark. And then that should get it going for you. Hopefully that will do it. Well, if not, feel free to post in the Facebook group. A lot of people are always in there. That is the lightShark users Facebook group about visualizers and connecting to different ones. And we should be able to get you sorted out there. No problem. Awesome, folks. Any other questions? Feel free. Let me know. I will hang out for a minute or two. But or else, thank you so much for being here today. It's been a blast teaching you guys, as always. And like I mentioned, happy to take any questions that come up to make sure that we get your questions answered today. You want to eliminate the wireless portion? Sure thing. Yeah, I know I've answered that too on Facebook lately a lot. And there is a video on YouTube about using a wireless router. Most simply, the biggest key is just kicking off the wireless in here. You do that once you're set up. You'll be working with this one here, the top Ethernet for that. Make sure the IP address and such is within the same range as your computer or whatever you're controlling the tablet. Make sure that stuff's in the same ranges. I sound like a broken record when I say that, but it is important. And also, when you're using a router, the biggest key is that the IP address of the router needs to be in the same IP address range as the lightShark and any visualizer or anything else. So everybody needs to be on the same IP address range, or else it's not going to work. That is the biggest key with networking. So usually, like I am here, when I'm on a consumer type router, external router, I just default to the 192.168.0 range because that's what most routers are default set to. And then you're off to the races. You're not having to configure your router separately, and it'll just work. So that's my biggest recommendation there for you as well. Very cool. Awesome. Well, thank you all. Great to have you here today. So awesome to have everybody. It's been a blast talking with you. Of course, as always, we do save a replay of this, and when it's ready, we'll post it on the Facebook group. You'll be able to find it. Link there to the YouTube channel. It'll be there, so you can catch that. And I hope you guys have a great day. I don't know what the weather's like in your world, but it's gotten real nice here in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm excited for it. So thank you guys for hanging out today. Link for the Facebook group. Absolutely. We are going to pull it up right here. Boom. There it is, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out today. And we will see you around the web. Thanks.